Good evening, everybody. All right, we're going to be picking back up on our lesson 9, page 4, where we are working our way through the Decalogue. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about last week is, I wonder if you know this, there's actually debate among scholars as to whether, to the number of the commandments. There are some that say that there are 9. There are some that says there's 10, and there's some that says there's 12. And it's interesting how they go about counting them. So there is some debate. If you want some interesting reading on how they do this and how some of the Jewish scholars and rabbis from the past have done this, they've end up with either some end up with 9, some end up with 10, some end up with 12. And so what they do, in some cases, they combine the first 2 commandments into one. Right? So what are the first 2 commandments? No other gods and no idols. They combine that into one. And then there are some that take the 10th and divide it into 2. And where they divide, where it makes distinctions about coveting, that commands are split where it says different things that you are not to covet. It makes a distinction into different ones there. So, it's interesting. But there is a verse later on that uses the word 10 commandments. And so I think we'll go with how God has, and Moses has categorized these as 10 and work off of that. And that's where we get the word Decalogue. Right? And so, to my recollection, and we talked about no other gods and how this was fundamental to all others, right? It's a very fundamental thing. No graven images. And we discussed some of that. We talked about where it talks about God's a jealous God, right? And how that's... Now, is it possible for man to be jealous and not sin? I see some hesitation here. You're like, is this a trick question? Yeah. I saw, Beth, did you want to get, what do you think? Yeah. Right, rightfully wanting. Now, what is yours, but especially when we talk about God being a jealous God, it's in the context of what kind of relationship? Covenant relationship. And so he's about to enter into a covenant relationship here with these folks, isn't he? With the nation of Israel and desiring worship from him. And so within the marriage relationship, is there a covenant established? Should the husband be jealous for his wife and wife for her husband? Yes, not in a, we know that can turn to sin, right? But you should want what is rightfully yours according to that covenant. And so it's interesting to think about. Now, God, we know that He is holy and righteous, and above all, He's the owner and deserves all praise and glory, and He's the owner of everything. So jealous for Him is definitely takes on a different meaning. Now, we move to this idea of no profanity. Chapter 20, verse 7, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Now, the Hebrew word translated vain comes from the root meaning to be empty or worthless. Now, invoking God's name in jest, in an unworthy cause, or in a religious lip service are examples of violation of the third command. God's name was not to be misused in any way. Now, the basis for this, do we see the basis for this carried forth in even a broader sense in the New Testament about our language? Yeah, no unwholesome word? Okay, yes. As far as yes being yes and no being no. So it's very interesting here when we talk about that, and we're going to see how that comes forward in some of the other commands too. But specifically, invoking God's name in jest, in an unworthy cause, or religious lip service are examples. Now, observing the Sabbath, verses 28 through 11. And the seventh day was to be a holy day. The Israelites were to rest from their labors. God himself set the pattern for this observance. After the 6 creative days, he rested or ceased from his creative activity. Now, question. Throughout the world and history, where do we get the concept of a day? God. So all cultures only know about what a day is a day because of reading Genesis? What'd you say? Right. See, regardless of knowledge of what Genesis says, right? People understand what a day is. Right? And when you come to different cultures and things, whether or not they have a biblical worldview or not, do they have concept of months and years? What is that based on? What is a month based on? The lunar calendar, right? Cycles of the moon. What about a year? Where do we get the idea of a year? What? Say it, Brian. Yeah, one full trip around the sun is a year, right? So these things are based on what we observe basically in the night sky, day sky. You know, the revolution of the earth, a rotation of the earth, a revolution around the sun, the lunar movements and whatnot. But where does a 7-day week come in? Where does that concept come from? Can you get that from anything to do with the sun, moon, or stars? Can you get the concept of a week from the sun, moon, or stars? You cannot get that. In fact, in other cultures, you do not have the concept of a week found outside of what is prescribed in the Bible, the 7-day cycle. There's nothing, sun, moon, or stars, movements of the earth that end up with a week. You can't get there. So the concept of a week comes from God in the Bible specifically. Now, since God is the creator and we believe that everything began with 2 people, right? Then would the cultures and people from that point forward have the concept of a week, even from Adam and Eve moving forward? Right? Do you think Adam and Eve knew about the 6 creative days and the day of rest? Probably. We know for sure who knew about it. Well, we know Moses knew about it because he wrote the Pentateuch, but surely the people between Adam and Eve and Moses knew about it as well, what a week was. And so a week, we understand, is based on this. Now, this is fascinating. In verse 10 of chapter 20, you have, in it, you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. There are 7 categories, 7 types of living beings are commanded to observe the 7th day. You know, sometimes we talk about numerology and things like that. Could there be meaning behind the number here? Could there be? When he goes through this list, what is the idea that's trying to get across? Everybody. Everybody, and everybody includes people, right? But the list here is even further to your animals too, right? So it's pretty much Everything, you know, and then if you understand moral perfection, completeness is found in the number 7 and number 10, but here, you know those things, that there could be something to that. It's interesting to note. Now, I want you to ask this question. In most of everybody that's here, in their situations, you've raised children or grandchildren, and you might have said before, and the Bible says you need to obey me. Am I the only one that's ever said that? Come on, people, fess up. Okay. Bible, I mean, you're supposed to obey your parents, right? What if I were to tell you that this verse actually, where it says to obey our parents, we use that wording a lot, that obeying is not enough. What's the word that's used? Is that different than obey? What's the difference? You can obey somebody you don't respect. So there's respect tied here, honor and respect. Would we say that honor your father and mother, that there's a greater significance than simple obedience? Now, would obedience be a necessary component of honoring? Yeah, but it's not all. You know, when I was studying this and I was reading Doc Smith's comments on this, they hit me like a ton of bricks. Because when we talk about societies that are built around honor, give me a society that's built around honor. Okay, yeah, a lot of our Eastern cultures are built on honor, right? I know some of you fellers like watching the old samurai movies, right? Right? And that word comes up a lot, right? When we talk about honor, there's a lot tied to that word. There's a deep, rich meaning there. When you honor someone or you honor a code, so honoring your father and mother is more than just simply obeying them. It's like, I really like this. The word, this word here, this command, protects the family. Honor includes, but goes beyond obedience. Several times in Scripture, now, where else do we see this concept of honor? Who's it attached to? God. We're told to honor God, right? Now think about this. We're told to honor God. Well, we would understand that means obey, but it means more too, right? It's the same exact word in both the Hebrew and the Greek that's used here for honoring our parents. Now, here's something else that's interesting. There are skeptics of the Bible out there that say that the Bible demeans and degrades women. You ever heard that? Paul was a misogynistic pig. Right? The Old Testament, the Old Law, that's a bunch that just puts women down and demeans them and all this kind of stuff. Don't let this slip by where it says honor your father and your mother. Think about that. When you think about male and female roles and respect, it doesn't say honor the father and leave it at that. See, there are some cultures today, even the Eastern cultures, that would honor only the male. Right? But here it says honor the father and mother. Several times in Scripture this verb is used with God as a subject. This underscores the seriousness of this injunction. Now, there is a promise that is attached to this command. Those who honor parents would live long in the land which God was giving them. The requirement to honor mother as well as father shows that the woman in Israel occupied a place of honor in her family. Now, would this be only the woman in Israel? Is this only attached to the Jewish families, this principle? Would it carry forward to Christianity? Absolutely. Now remember this chart that I gave you here and how we've got it written here, duty to God, duty to man, and then summarized in those two verses found in Matthew chapter 22, 37 and 39, when it says all the law and the prophets hang on these. This is kind of a breakdown of that. Keep that in mind. Now, chapter 20, verse 13 says, in mine, you shall not kill. Yeah, you guys remember our discussion. Actually, mine does say, you shall not murder. If yours does say kill, you need to scratch it out. Put murder. There's a big difference, and we discussed that when we were talking about our capital punishment discussion in T3. No murder. The law regarded life as sacred. Life could be taken from man only on God's terms. Unnecessary taking of life out of anger or greed was prohibited. Now, Jesus extended this commandment to include anger and verbal abuse of another. That should make you think twice. For sure. Now, remember what we said about what our society is proclaiming as good and right, and how those things conflict with these commands. What would have conflicted with honoring parents in our society? I mean, does our society promote honoring parents? You know, and this is something I struggle with routinely, is what shows to allow Sherlana to watch, because there's a lot of innocent shows where the parents are portrayed as idiots. And the kids are the ones running the show. And then you talk about no profanity, the way we speak in God's name. Is God's name revered in our society? No. So, and we talk about no murder, right? And what's being proclaimed as good in our society. Yeah. No adultery. Verse 14 of chapter 20. You shall not commit adultery. This word protected the sanctity of marriage. And Jesus expanded and talked about this and this prohibition to include lust in Matthew 5. No adultery, no stealing. Property rights were protected by this word. The attempt to get something for nothing is prohibited. See, if you think about this, is stealing limited to sneaking in and grabbing in someone's house some of their possessions and leaving with it? Is that the only way that you can steal? What's that? Yeah, I mean, there's many different ways that stealing can be accomplished. And so I really like the way that's worded. The attempt to get something for nothing is prohibited. No lying. Truth was protected here. The whole spectrum of sins of the tongue was prohibited. Would slander fall under this? Gossip? Malice? Now, think of this. This is interesting. Chapter 20, verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. No coveting. No coveting. The heart as well as actions were to be guarded from evil. Now, this is the most comprehensive of all the commandments. Why do you think we can make that statement? Why is coveting the most comprehensive? Mm-hmm. There's a big umbrella here when you really think about what's at the root of things. This idea of coveting really is, it's foundational to a lot of other sins. I mean, stealing especially, right? I mean, would you steal something that you don't want? So here we have just a brief discussion of the Decalogue. Now, let me ask you this question. We've got these 10 commandments here, right? We agree that there's 10? Okay. Did God speak any of these commandments? Did God repeat any of these commandments in this account? Did He repeat any of them? What we've studied? I mean, in this account here at the foot of Sinai, God repeat any of these? What's that? Emphasizing. Was anything repeated per se? Not yet. But if we keep reading. Yes. Yeah, so because we have the tablets being written, but here in this account, in this thing, what I find this interesting, if we keep reading in verse 18, and all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Then they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but let not God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of Him may remain with you, so that you may not sin." So the people stood at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven." So they've been experiencing this whole thing. And then in verse 23, look what he says again. "You shall not make other gods besides me, gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves. You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. And if you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it. And you shall not go up the steps of my altar, that your nakedness may be exposed on it." So, verse 23 says, it does seem to be repetition of the first 2 commands, doesn't it? "You shall not make other gods besides me, gods of silver or gods of gold you shall not make for yourselves." It seems to be kind of a conglomeration of those. "You shall have no other gods before me, you shall worship before me, and you shall not make any images." And then he gives them instructions to build an altar. So, did God repeat any of these commandments in this account? Yeah. Yep. So, fear the people. The people were terrified at the sights and sounds of Sinai. They kept their distance from the mount. They requested Moses to be a mediator between them and God. Moses assured them that they had nothing to fear. God was testing them. A healthy fear of God would keep them from sinning. Moses then turned from the people and walked up into the thick cloud which covered the mountain, into the presence of God. The first item of business on the mount was to set forth a means by which the people who fear the Lord could nonetheless approach Him in worship. Since the invisible God had spoken to them at Sinai, they were not to attempt in any way to make representations of Him to aid in worship. Now, again, think about what they're used to. In the religious context of the day, this was a revolutionary requirement. Because what had they witnessed their whole lives? You worship something, you do what? You make an image of it. I mean, they were everywhere. Everything was tied to an image. Remember when we were doing the plagues and we were talking about the different gods and how they were represented in their different forms and what they knew, they always associated their gods with images. And so this is what they had been around and been exposed to. That was their worldview. Now, if you look back in verse 24 and 25, verse 25 says, "If you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it." So how are they supposed to make this altar? Uncut stones, right? And earth. It says to use earth and uncut stones. Well, I mean, what's the problem? What would be the big deal of cutting a stone to make it fit for what you want? Why would that be a problem? The guy that made it? What would be their tendency? Possibly. Yeah, to carve an image or a name or something into that stone. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Go ahead. Certainly. That opportunity for them to act was there before them. And did they have silver or gold? Yes. Oh yeah, they plundered. So they had all this stuff, right? Well, and so when we get into what we're going to call the golden calf tragedy, it was tragedy. When we get there, I think it's chapter 34, we got a ways. Man, it didn't take long for them to put that thing together, which is, it's really quite sad. But yeah, it does. I think it just goes to show man's proclivity towards such things, but also how entrenched that worldview was within them, what they had always known and seen in Egypt. Now, here's another interesting thing. In verse 26, it says, "You shall not go up by steps to my altar." So this altar could not have steps, and it says that your nakedness may not be exposed on it. What in the world? So does that mean every time you climb a flight of steps, you're naked? Okay. Well, Steve's onto something here, right? Their attire was like a robe kind of a thing. And so the idea here is that they were to be completely covered, so even the ankle exposed here would make this an unholy, unsanctified event. So no steps. No steps. The proper place to meet God was at the altar. The regulations concerning the altar were these. It was to be made of earth or stones. No cut stones were to be used. It could be located wherever God causes His name to be honored, appeared in vision, voice, or action. The altar was not to have steps, and that is why. That those that were doing the sacrifices and working in and around the altar, they had to be completely covered because they were to be holy. Now, we move in to an area that gets a little, where we start getting into some of the individual precepts, laws, specific things. And we're going to approach this from a kind of a bird's eye perspective and make highlight some of these things as we go through. We're not going to read every single one of these laws and precepts now. We're going to highlight some things, and some interesting things come out of this. But just for time's sake, now if you want to go through and read these and start digging around in there, I think you'll find some good stuff. But like I said, we're going to look at 4 collections of precepts that are found in this section of Exodus. Many of the laws here are caustic, meaning they are framed in a conditional way. Many of these laws are conditional. This section is called the Book of the Covenant, or simply the Covenant Code. Covenant code. So this was that which they were about to enter into this agreement, and this is basically all the therefores and whatnots, the fine print of the contract. These are the things that you're going to be held accountable for. So the first grouping would be precepts or laws regarding servants. So a Hebrew servant might have to sell himself into servanthood if he could not meet his financial obligations. In such a case, the debtor could not be made to serve more than 6 years. And we come to find out later on that a 7-year cycle for things was kind of like a reset for the Jews, and it eventually had a name attached to it. Yep, year of Jubilee. So, the basic principle regarding his release was that he should go free in exactly the same condition in which he came into servanthood. So what does that mean? Well, this actually has to do with about how he's married or not married, or what happens. Now, this is kind of fascinating here. If he was married when he became a servant, his wife would go out with him. So you come in married, you get to keep her on the way out. Now, your perspective on that's your own thing. Yeah, good, bad, or somewhere in between. Now, here's where it gets tricky. If while you're serving, and if you married a maidservant of his master during that 6 years, he did so realizing that when he went free, his wife and children stayed with his master. Again, you could look at that, and I'm just kidding. It's an opportunity, or hopefully if you married her, you did so out of love, and you have children, and so there was a way that this could continue. And so what was designed here was, in this case, he might choose to remain a servant, then surrender his wife and children. If so, he declared his intention before the judges. The pierced ear was the symbol of perpetual servanthood voluntarily chosen. So we've heard about that, pierce my ear. Right? So this is continuing in voluntary servanthood, and this would go on perpetually. That you're not going to be locked into this 6-year cycle moving forward. Once you did that, it was a decision to stay. So there were the precepts in verses 1 through 11. In verses 12 through chapter 21, 12 through 22, 20, we have precepts regarding penalties. Now, if you recall, this comes back to our discussion of capital punishment. And we talk about the concept of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That has been summed up in this Latin phrase called lex talionis. And so that's what, if you see here, this concept of the lex talionis. Now, in our discussion of capital punishment, as we discussed in the things that Jesus was saying in the New Testament and what we read in the Old Testament, what was the principle that guided all these things? The eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. What was the major principle that we came away with? This might be a little hard to pull out of the recesses, but let's see if you remember. There was a certain context for the way that this should be used, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. There was a context where this should be used and a context where this shouldn't be used. That's it. Yes, the context of this eye for an eye was for the state in what they were to carry out. The lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, does not apply to personal justice or personal vengeance. And that was the distinction that Jesus was making. So the basic principles of Mosaic jurisprudence was the lex talionis stated in chapter 21, verses 24 and 25. The eye for an eye principle was not intended to be a guideline for personal ethics, but a principle for national justice, for the state. And so this does carry forward to this day. Now, here's the next principle that carries forward in that. Just within eye for an eye itself, tooth for a tooth, what's the concept that this is putting forward? Justice. Okay, in what way? Let's boil this down. That's it. That the crime, that the punishment fit the crime. So, that's an important principle, right, of justice. Because sometimes we would say that if it's not based on that principle, if you don't have that in mind, then you might have a crime that's committed and an unjust punishment. You know, my mind goes to, again, some of our Eastern cultures, right? We're familiar with stories where I believe there was a fellow who tore a poster off of in a foreign country and was imprisoned and given lashes on his back. Now that doesn't seem to be eye for an eye, does it? So the crime fitting the punishment is an important principle. So stated simply, Exodus 20, 21, 24, and 25 argues that the punishment must always fit the crime. Jesus did not repudiate this principle in Matthew 5. He rejected the misuse of lex talionis in personal vengeance. And with those understandings, that really set the stage for our discussion of capital punishment when we talked about it. So those were precepts regarding punishment. Now there are precepts regarding abuse. There are 6 prohibitions next appear which have no stipulated penalties. God's people were not to mistreat the following. They weren't to mistreat strangers. They must remember that they were once strangers in Egypt. They were not to mistreat widows and orphans. But even more than the mistreatment of current orphans and widows is if you were the cause. So if God should hear the cry of these destitute ones, his anger would be aroused. He would bring the sword against the nation, making their wives widows and the children fatherless. So those who would cause those to be widows or to have no fathers, those that would anger God. The poor, money was to be lent without interest to a destitute brother. A cloak taken as security for a loan had to be given back at night. Why? Yeah. Had to be given back at sundown so that the poor brother would not suffer in the cold. So those in positions of authority were not to be abused. They should not blaspheme their judges or curse the ruler of the people. Just going to pause there for a moment. And for Christians, this works both ways. You know, we see examples. I mean, when it says to pray for our leaders, there are some that, in my lifetime, that have been rulers over us that I don't agree with. It doesn't mean that I don't pray for them. As a Christian, we're supposed to. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to agree with them or that we shouldn't take, in our society, appropriate measures to do what we can as individuals to promote what we believe to be good. But we shouldn't blaspheme the judges or curse the ruler of the people. Another thing, God was to be protected. They should not withhold from him their offerings of grain, wine, or cattle. And also we recall that as a result of this whole ordeal, it goes back to the night of the Passover, the firstborn sons and cattle belonged to God. Yet there was to be consideration for the animals, for the calf was to be left with its mother for 7 days before giving it to the Lord. And also themselves as holy men, they were to eat only the meat of animals properly slain. Animals torn by wild beasts were not fit for consumption by a holy people. Now, what could be the possibility of that one? What could be behind that law, that precept, that warning? Okay, it could be disease, right? Yeah, and it could be tied to another thing as well. I don't know. I don't know how many of you have been like, ooh, roadkill. Yummy. Well, let's throw that in a stew pot and... yeah, well, but I mean, we know that could be problematic. But what else? Okay, well, we're talking basically more about consumption here, about eating. Is it possible that was a practice of the pagan around there, the places that they would be going? And so many times we find that a lot of these laws are given to set them apart from where the people that they were going to. Now, I think it's just common sense, really. Could be what's really behind it, but they could also be that that the pagan nations didn't care, and if it was however they came upon it, they could eat it. So we have precepts regarding justice found in chapter 23, 1 through 12. And here we have these basic principles that we found in the Decalogue. We kind of see them kind of emphasized here. The first 12 verses of Exodus 23 spell out the obligations to treat all men justly and with compassion. False testimony was forbidden. So that takes kind of the lying and bear false witness. This takes, in these 3 verses, takes a little bit further, more specifically. Taking advantage of an enemy was forbidden. Let's look at these verses. These are a little unusual. Listen to what this says. Verses 4 and 5, chapter 20. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, your enemy's ox or his donkey, what might be it's your enemy now. What might be the first thing you think? Let's be honest. You might be like, well, looky here, I got me a new donkey, right? Or shoo it away even further, right? But it says, you shall surely return it to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying helpless under its load, you shall refrain from leaving it to him. You shall surely release it with him. It's an interesting principle there. Justice also includes perversion of justice was forbidden. Oppression of foreigners living in the land was forbidden. The poor as well as wild animals were to be allowed free access to field, vineyard, and olive grove in the Sabbath years. Again, we come back to that idea of Jubilee. Now, I had a thought here in 23, 10, and 11. And you shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield, but on the 7th year you shall let it rest and let it lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat, and whatever they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. So an idea popped into my head here. With an olive grove or a vineyard, if you're to leave it lie fallow and not harvest from it, you leave it for them. I wonder if it was possible where have you guys, anybody here ever grown grapes? Anybody ever? Okay. The yard, I don't know how this happened. I thought everybody had this growing up, but I had at our house, we had about 1.5 acres, and we had apple trees, peach trees, cherry trees, grapes. We had a pear tree that gave 1 pear a year, that worthless thing. And it's the one that outlived everything, that dumb pear tree. Now, all those fruit trees have since died. All the apple trees, all the peach trees, cherry trees, they've all died. The one that outlasted them all was that 1 pear a year pear tree. But we still have the grapes. It's not hard, really, to start your own grapes off of what's already there. What do you need? You just need a branch of it, right? And what could you do with that? Go plant it. I just wonder if that was permitted. Why would I mean, you understand where my mind's going with this? No? Yeah. The whole give a man a fish, teach him to fish. You see where my mind's going with this? I wonder if it included the ability for them to take what they needed to start their own. Sure. To start their own. Yeah, I just wonder if that was included here. Because that principle does seem to be one of real wisdom, isn't it? To help people out of that situation. Just a thought. So, dependents, man and beast, were to be given rest on the weekly Sabbath. was the sixth principle. Now, precepts regarding worship. The reference to the Sabbath in 23:12 suggests the transition to precepts relating to worship. Israelites were never to invoke the names of other gods in worship, oaths, curses, or prayers, or any way which suggested that these gods really existed. Annual feasts 3 times a year. So starting off, they started off from here with 3 feasts. So we should know the first one. We better know this without reading. I know y'all are reading. I should have told you not to read. We should know the first one. Unleavened bread, right? Why should we know that one based upon... Because they've already been commanded to do this, right? And that included the Passover. And then we have, from this point forward, the Feast of Harvest, later known as Pentecost. So after the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover, how many days until the Feast of Harvest, later known as Pentecost? 50. And then the Feast of Ingathering or Tabernacles. Now, was this all the feasts that Israel, in their history? Yeah, there were more that come along the way. But this is what they're starting with here. So these annual feasts, they were commanded. Now, we have promises of the law. Promises of the law. Now, I'm moving through this because I want to get to something. There's 2 reasons. I want to finish this. And 2, there's something here really so cool. And I was excited when I saw this. Because I don't ever recall thinking about this. So promises of law. Exodus 23 concludes with 3 promises designed to encourage obedience to the law. The first one was this. Oh man, I want to talk about this too. God would send an angel. Let's look at this. Verses 23, 20 through 33. Yeah, verse 20. Behold, I'm going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I prepared. Be on your guard before him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious toward him, for he will not pardon your transgression, since my name is in him. Stop right there. Okay, first, God would send an angel to guard Israel along the way to the promised land. Now, is there anything here in this text that would clue us in and is what we're dealing with here, what we're looking at? Is there anything in these 2 verses, in 20 and 21? All right, so think of other angels that we know about. So, would it be said of Gabriel or Michael to obey him? Would it be said of Gabriel or Michael to obey him because he will pardon your sin? For he will not pardon your transgression. Who has the authority to pardon transgressions? Do angels? And this concept of my name is in him, is that ever said of any angel? This is, in my humble opinion, and what I'm reading here and what I've studied, this is definitely a part of the Godhead. And the pre-incarnate Christ, I would say that when it talks about the angel of the Lord, I think that's who we're dealing with here in these verses. Now think about that for just a second. What's he doing? He's going to go before them. Yep. But if you will truly obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them. That's pretty cool, right? Second, if they destroyed every vestige of paganism and worshipped only the Lord, he would give them prosperity in the land. He would bless their food and water, heal their disease, and give them a full and fruitful life. Third, God would gradually give them possession of the land. And then it goes on to describe, now this is true, the fear of God, like the sting of a hornet, would cause the inhabitants of Canaan to turn and flee. Okay, I'll tell you this right now. There are a couple things in this world that can make a grown man look like a scared little girl. One of those is coming face to face with the spider web, right? You ever seen that? Or if you've ever gotten into some bees. You ever stood there when you got into the bees and just like, oh, they're just bees? Oh, man, you run. I tell you what, one time I was mowing with a push mower in the front yard, and I went over a yellow jacket nest. Woo! They lit me up. They got up into my shorts, and it was bad. But I took off a running. It was. But the whole time you're running, you're waving your arms, or even a daggone horsefly. There's been times I know I've been out in the yard mowing and I look like a complete fool, slapping and waving my arms all over the place because I'm trying to get away from these things. But so you talk about the imagery here that God's saying that the inhabitants of Canaan are going to flee like that they just got into a hornet's nest. That's some very vivid imagery, isn't it? Anybody here never been stung? Never been stung. That you've never been stung by a bee? Anybody? Everybody here has been stung? Well, I'd like to meet somebody that's never been stung. Everybody, yeah, hurts. So, and then it gives a description of the east and west and where the land's going to be. All the inhabitants were to be driven out. Now, possession of the law. Here's the part I want to really get to. And if you guys, I'll beg your forgiveness if you just let me get to this. What's the coolest place that you've ever eaten a meal? Not just the food, but the ambiance. So you can just picture sitting there and it was the most majestic view, or the way the restaurant was constructed, that it was just like awe-inspiring, beautiful, the ambiance. I can see some of the husbands and wives kind of whispering to each other, remember that where we were? Can you think of some place like that? McDonald's. Oh, yeah. We're at a luau. I mean, we've been so blessed. Sitting there at that luau and looking out over the ocean and the sun setting. I mean, whew, that's pretty cool. I mean, amazing. Now, I can tell you this. The most beautiful thing or amazing thing that you've ever experienced, there's people that we're about to read about that had the best dinner show they've ever had. That anyone's ever had. So before leaving the mount with this body of laws, Moses was directed to bring Aaron and his sons and the 70 elders back to the mount. They were to worship the Lord at a distance, albeit much closer than the people. Moses alone would be permitted to approach the Lord. So verses 1 through 11, chapter 24. Actually, we're going to jump ahead here. We're not going to read that. I'm going to read the passages down when we talk about the celebration. So, the law, Israel took possession of the law in two stages. The law was received in the camp and celebrated in the mount. Received in the camp. Moses reported to the people all that the Lord had said. They responded enthusiastically to all the words and the laws of God. Moses then wrote down all that the Lord had said. The following day, Moses led in a formal commitment service. An altar was constructed. What do we know about this altar? Yes, it was made of uncut stones and earth, and there weren't any steps. Now, my mind goes back to what? My mind here went back to the video we saw, right? Where they actually were looking down and like, oh, there's an altar. There's something that looks just like. And also, remember what they found? The round pillars? Now, those were okay to cut. It didn't say for the pillars, but the altar was to be uncut. Now, on this altar, an altar was constructed with 12 pillars representing the tribes surrounding it. Unnamed young men offered burnt and peace offerings to the Lord. Blood was sprinkled on the altar itself to sanctify it. Then the book of the covenant was read before the people. Moses then sprinkled blood on the people. Now, think about this. Would it be possible for him to do this for 2 million people? Okay, so I think it's it's sound logic to conclude, it's logical to conclude that the 70 elders that were present there represented the people as a whole. The blood was sprinkled on the altar. The book of the covenant was read. Moses sprinkled the blood on the people, possibly as represented by the 70 elders. The blood symbolized the fact that God had now entered into a covenant with Israel. So there had been sacrifices made. They had been sprinkled with blood. And look at the result of this. This is the part that I was like, oh, I've never. Listen to this. Okay, chapter 24, verses 9 through 11. Then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. Now these two knuckleheads later on do some stuff, but just when you read what they got to experience, and they still did what they did, Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire as clear as the sky itself. This is while they're eating. They've sat down to partake of a meal together, and this is the view. That's crazy. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel, and they beheld God, and they ate and drank. Now, why was there this kind of, why did God allow this kind of fellowship with him? They got to experience something that I don't know if anybody else has ever experienced anything like this. Why were they allowed to do this? What permitted this? His love. His desire to have this entering into this relationship. See, this covenant has just been signified. So there's obviously love here in entering into this covenant relationship. Their obedience. Come on now, think. What happened? What did Moses do? The what? And did what with it? They were just sprinkled with the blood. There was atonement made. They entered into this covenant relationship, and then they're able to have this kind of event occur. Now, what were they eating? Most likely. Come on. They were eating the sacrifices, right? Remember what happened with the priest of Midian? Help me. Jethro. When Jethro, they made sacrifices and they did their thing and then they ate what they had just sacrificed. Remember that? That's probably what happened here. In the blood that was sprinkled, they had just entered into this covenant relationship through what? Blood. The atonement was made, and then they're able to have this kind of deep fellowship with God while they ate. That ought to make the hair on your arm stand up. Well, here's what it says. And they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire as clear as the sky itself. Now, God in his full glory? No. Because we know what? No man can see God, right? So what were they able to perceive? His glory in this theophany of some sorts. That's pretty amazing. Can you ask a question? You have a question? Yes, sir. No. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead. Did he eat with them? Yes. I don't read that. I'm just asking. Where it says, and they ate and drank? Are you saying that they... The sons of Israel, and they beheld God, and they ate and drank. Yeah, that they would apply to the folks there. No, I don't think. I don't think we could make that leap. That would be pretty cool, though. You have to wait for Jesus before you could say you had a meal like that with God. All right, any questions or comments, thoughts? Go ahead, Beth. Okay. Mm-hmm. 24, mine says, you shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it. Where are you reading the if? 25. And if you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, I get that. That they could be of earth or of stone or both. That could be where the if comes in. That's interesting. But it also could be tied to if you obey and do what you're told. Yeah, yeah. Because we know that they were always obedient and did what they told. What they was told. No. All right, any other questions or comments? Thank you for letting me go over a little bit.